I'm now joined by Thomas Frank, who's the author of several books, including What's the Matter with Kansas, Listen Liberal, and now The People Know, A Brief History of Anti-Populism, which I just read and is a very excellent book. And I'm excited to talk to Thomas, even though he's having trouble with his video, so he's a disembodied voice.
I'm really sorry. I apologize again.
No, nothing to apologize for. But I really appreciate you coming on. I will say I read Listen Liberal back in 2016, and it had a big impact on me. And I really enjoyed the People Know. And I think it's a really interesting contribution to to our discussion about populism and the things that we mean by that, and how that relates to the kind of explicit anti-populism you get from a certain kind of centrist liberal.
Yes, you figured that out. You read all the way to the end.
I did read all the way to the end. And I was extremely actually interested in some of the connections that you were drawing in the last couple of chapters, and I do want to get to that. But first, I want to kind of set the scene for the way you start the book, because there's this really interesting contrast between that you draw. Between the way that populism is discussed by academics, right? You hear this a lot. People who are like populism experts,
there's a whole academic discipline. I don't know if discipline is the right word. A pedagogy, let's say. It's sort of interdisciplinary. But yeah, you're right about that. The very fashionable academic pedagogy, and people are forever emailing me about to comment on. Well, long story short, they're not really interested in what I'm saying here. So,
yeah, no, absolutely, and you can see why, right? Because the things that we hear from people in this industry of anti-populism experts, essentially, is that populism is essentially anti-intellectual. Populism is essentially racist and xenophobic. And of course, all of that makes a really interesting contrast to the original populists, because if you're going to make a generalization about some category, there's an interesting question about, okay, like, how do we figure out what counts as part of this category? This is the kind of thing that philosophers love to do. Conceptual analysis, figure out, okay, something counts as an instance of this larger phenomenon.
Political science, this is what they do now. So,
yeah, absolutely, right? But it seems like if you're going to make a generalization about populism, whatever you include as an example of populism or not, you should probably include the populists, like the people who came up with the name.
Yeah, so that should be example number one, but it's almost never mentioned in this literature, in this sort of this academic, this pedagogy that we're describing. They never talk about those guys, the people who actually invented the word, the American group that came out of the Midwest. I assume that your listeners might have never heard of it. So why don't we talk about that for a minute? The people who invented the word. It was an American word. It's not a French word. It's not a Latin word. It was made up on a train between Kansas City and Topeka in the year 1891. And it meant something very specific. And it was a reference to this third party movement in America, a left-wing third party movement. That was, like I say, that was on the left. It was my people. And that's very uncomfortable for the people who want to talk about populism nowadays, who want to define it as being, this other thing, because the original, what you described earlier, because the original populist movement has almost nothing to do with that stuff.
Yeah.
So it's really inconvenient for them, and so they leave it out. They don't talk about it.
Yeah, so the original populist movement, we're talking about the People's Party,
Yeah.
which is probably the most like electorally viable third party that's existed since
Yeah, well,
the,
there were since the Republicans
yeah,
were the third party that managed to kill off one of the two major parties. And then populism, rather than killing off one, they thought they were going to do the same thing, but instead what happened was they got absorbed by the Democrats, largely. I mean, it wasn't not completely.
yeah, and I think there's a complicated history there where parts of, you know, people who were involved in the People's Party end up in later efforts like the Socialist Party of Eugene Debs.
Yep.
Uh,
Well, Debs himself was a populist at one point. And after the big strike in 1894, he came out of prison and he was a populist. And he was their hero for a while. But they didn't last very long after that, only a couple more years. And then that was, that was the end of them. They got on board with the William Jennings Bryan Express, and
yeah, yeah.
they didn't make it across the finish line.
Right. So I want to talk about that election. You know, you spend a lot of time in the first part of the book talking about how everything these academics who study populism in
Yeah,
this
what they
vague,
call populism. They
yeah,
mean they mean Trump. They mean Marine Le Pen. They mean like the
yeah,
president of
Bolsonaro,
Poland
sure.
and the president of Hungary and this sort of thing. These kind of bigoted nationalists. You know, that's what they mean by it. And it is truly a strange turn of events that they use the word populism to describe those people. Not that
Yeah,
there's anything wrong with studying those people. I mean, I used to write about them, I should say. I used to write about them all the time. They need to be studied. We need to understand what makes Trumpists tick, you know.
right.
But it's just, you know,
Yeah,
there is a price to abusing the word populism, and we'll come to that in a little while. Anyhow, I interrupted you. You wanted to talk about the 1890s.
oh no, I do, right, because but I think what you're talking about is an important bit of scene setting here, because what the academic populism experts mean when they say populism, right? They're mostly talking about this kind of Trump, Bolsonaro, Le Pen, right-wing pseudo-populist authoritarianism. But I feel like oftentimes the effect of using this word populism in the way that they do is to equate that with and thus delegitimize, you know, like nice social democrats like Bernie
Yes,
Sanders.
of course. That's a
Yeah,
big part of the problem. And then, but I mean, that's part of it. Well, think about it. That is literally what they are doing. They're taking the name of the original American social democratic movement and using it to describe proto-fascism. So that by itself is pretty screwed up.
yeah, yeah.
But
And one
in a
of the
historical sense,
points,
but there's a
yeah,
larger way in which the anti-populism is a kind of a fear of democracy and a fear of mass working class movements. So the hatred and fear of left-wing movements is baked in. You know, you can say, oh, you know, well, I mean, there's people who I mean, these are by and large the scholars that you're talking about are liberals. They would call themselves liberals, you know. But my argument is that in the way the way they use the word populism betrays a real suspicion, if not hostility, to democracy. Can I
yeah,
explain a little more what I mean? I think I've
yeah,
confused you, Ben. See,
absolutely.
I can see you very clearly. You can't see me at all, but I can see that I've confused you.
No, no. I mean, this. I mean, I did read your book. You say all this
Actually, you know
stuff
what?
there.
I'm actually in your house, and I'm going to come walking through that door right behind you here in just a second. And I'm going to pick up my book off your shelf from behind you, and
Yeah.
start reading from it.
No, that's great. Then everybody will see you on YouTube.